Thanks, Tim. Nista nenaskamon. Kakia no temte kanuakomagan nenaskamon. Nista kenaskom tenoa kakiel. Ogimawak kiteyak iskoyak napeyak. Anuts kagiskao no tawinan smanto kanaskumtin. Algonquin Nation kanaskum tenoa. Kiteyak Elder Mike. Big thanks to Elder Mike and the Algonquin Nation here, to Grand Chief Verna Paulson, Grand Chief Jerome as well for the welcome. And to the chiefs, the delegates, friends and relatives right across Turtle Island, I say good morning. At the same time, we have our crowned representatives here, Minister Bennett. They're in the corner over here, and we want to acknowledge and thank you for participating, because this is a result and a follow-up from our July meeting. And in July in Vancouver, we said, hey, we've got to come together, and we've got to have a dialogue and a discussion about this rights recognition framework legislation. And so we committed at that time, we're going to have a forum. We're going to come together as soon as possible to talk about this, because this is important for us as First Nations people. This is very important. And so that's what this 2 days is about. Coming together as different nations and tribes right across Turtle Island for a dialogue and a discussion, to learn from each other, to listen to each other, and moving past and forward beyond the Indian Act. And we all say we all want to do that, but under our control, under our direction, under our leadership. And it's the rights and title holders that will drive that process. So we wanted to come together now, next few days, for that dialogue and discussion, and to learn from each other right across Turtle Island. And there are many nations and many tribes. I wanted to start off as well by saying it is a policy forum. It's not a special chiefs assembly. We have our special chiefs, or have our big chiefs meeting coming up in December 4, 5, and 6 in Ottawa here. And so we'll have further dialogue and debate and discussion there. But we wanted to bring together our people and our leaders as soon as we could after July. And when we look across Canada and Turtle Island, we look at ourselves as First Nations people, as Indigenous peoples. And you have Aboriginal rights in title. We have inherent rights. We have Aboriginal rights. We have treaty rights. One of the things our old people always tell us, one of the most important rights we have is the right to self-determination. That's one of the most important rights we have. And I've always mentioned these 5 elements that are so key to our survival as Indigenous peoples. And for that right to be recognized, not only in this domestic state called Canada, but internationally. And it's those 5 elements. Because as Indigenous peoples, we have our own languages. And in Canada, we have over 58 different languages. The Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, the Mohawk, the Algonquins, the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Coast Salish, there's so many. Dene, we have over 58. And so that's why one of the reasons we're focusing on revitalizing our Indigenous languages. It's one of the elements, the key elements to self-determination. And so it's always good to hear when the Algonquins welcome us to their nation's territory, you hear that language spoken. And whenever we go to other different nations and tribes, that language should always be there. Because that's one element. One element in that right to self-determination we recognize is language. And then we say we have our own lands. We have our own lands, we have our ancestral lands, traditional lands, and how we're starting to look at moving jurisdiction beyond our little reserve boundaries. Iskunagun in Cree is like land set aside, land put us, it's almost like leftovers. And they took all the best parts. It's almost when you kill a moose, you know, everybody else took all the best parts and left us the little bit of scraps. But it's lands. Our reservations. But now there's a big movement again to say, moving beyond our little reserve boxes, our ancestral lands, our traditional lands, so language and lands. And then our own laws. Our own laws. Not only will this country be based on common law and civil law, but there's laws, First Nations laws, creators' laws, natural laws that have to be incorporated into that system. So language, lands, laws. Identifiable peoples. We have identifiable peoples, the citizens of your nations and your tribes. And now with Deschenaux and Bill C-31, that's going to be a huge issue. Citizenship and nationhood, but our peoples. And then that fifth one, our own identifiable forms of government. 5 elements. And so that definition of that governance structure, and historically it's the clan system, it's our different societies, it's our different ways of doing and conducting businesses, it's our ceremonies from our Sundance lodges to the longhouses. So those 5 elements. And so when we say we recognize that right to self-determination, we were able to get into these nation-to-nation relationships with the Crown, entering into treaty, because we had that inherent right to self-determination, self-government, and we exercised that right to get into this relationship with the Crown. And we always hear this growing up, that nations make treaties, treaties do not make nations. Sovereignty, jurisdiction, self-determination. 5 elements. And I wanted to do this morning as just a brief historical context, just to set the stage as we build up towards this piece of legislation called this rights recognition. And when I go, I always do, so I start with these things, these 2 concepts called the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of terra nullius. And I always say start there, because ultimately in this country now called Canada, it's about land and resources. But when you start with those concepts of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, it speaks to relationships to the land. But these 2 doctrines are now fast becoming seen as illegal racist doctrines, because we always ask and tell the Crown, well, how did you gain title to land and territories? Our lands and territories. How did the Crown gain title? And so we question that. And so we even say, start using these words, assumed Crown sovereignty and assumed Crown jurisdiction, because it's assumed. That's what we believe as First Nations people. Even our reserves, our Crown lands, set aside for the use and benefit of Indian people, according to someone else's law. So even that has to be looked at and reviewed. So start with those concepts in terms of educating yourselves, getting your mind into that space of why we're here. Doctrine of discovery, doctrine of terra nullius. And then this very important document called the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Very important document. The Crown recognized our relationship and title to lands. Royal Proclamation, very important. And then the timeline, I go through this thing called the 1867 British North America Act, because Canada was a colony of Great Britain. And they used this British North America Act. And that key section in there, Section 9124, where it says the federal government is responsible for Indians and Indian lands. And we always used to hear that. It doesn't say Indians on Indian lands. It says Indians and Indian lands. So way back in 1867, the Crown recognized that we have lands and territory. Section 9124. Section 9124. 1867 BNA Act. And then something that's not really talked about too often, but the timeline is important. This 1870 Order in Council. Why is that important? What is that? Google that Order in Council. What is that? It's basically part of Canada's Constitution, but it also said when lands are taken up for settlement in this country called Canada, the Aborigines must be compensated on a fair and equitable basis. 1870 Order in Council. And so now, from an Indigenous perspective, we're on less than, what, 0.2% of the land base in Canada? 99.8 has been taken up for settlement. So compensation, 1870 Order in Council, very important. Then treaties, and I just put this treaties, but there's pre-Confederation treaties. The Truro Wampum Treaty, and that's a very important teaching about jurisdiction and sovereignty. And the Mohawks explain this better than anybody else about how we go to travel down this river of life. 2 canoes. How they say it. I'm even talking like a Mohawk accent. It's the 2 canoes. But our laws in one, and our jurisdiction in one. The other one, their laws and jurisdiction over here. And this one not goes over here, this one doesn't go over here. Both going down that river. It's a jurisdiction. So the Truro Wampum Treaty is a big teaching tool. Pre-Confederation treaties, our numbered treaties, the modern treaties they call, right from the James Bay Cree Agreement to all the 11 agreements in the Yukon, some of them in British Columbia, the modern treaties. There's these treaties we have. But when I talk about the numbered treaties, and all these treaties, Namoinsto, Dane, cede, surrendered, relinquish. But that's in the numbered treaties, you see those words. The Indians hereby cede, surrender, and relinquish title to the Crown. And in the case of Treaty 4, 75,000 square miles in Treaty 4 territory. In Treaty 6, it's 125,000 square miles. But do you think we really understood that we're giving that up? That's why we say, we don't understand. But our old people always say we agreed to share. Share the land. Share the land and resource wealth with our white brothers and sisters, the newcomers here. We'll share. And we're to mutually benefit from the land and resource wealth. They go at depth of a plow, we always go back home. Magiwai Uma, nothing underneath. So in our case, we say we still have unextinguished title to the resource wealth beneath the depth of a plow. But the treaties, high up, nation to nation. And we have a tie to that British Crown. These treaties are international in nature and should be governed by international law rather than domestic law. And that's from J.J. Curran, the Solicitor General of Canada in 1897. And he's talking about the Robinson-Huron treaties, Robinson-Superior treaties, the number. He's talking about that treaty. Very important, high up. And then, 1876, the Indian Act. So there was never an enforcement act or anything to implement treaty rights and inherent rights or recognition of Aboriginal rights and title. This Indian Act was imposed in 1876. And that's one of the reasons why we're here today. How do you move beyond that Indian Act? How do you move beyond that very destructive colonial piece of legislation that controlled everything in a First Nations life? This Indian Act's been there in 1876, and it's now 2018, and we still have it. But now there is a movement and a trend to start talking and thinking outside that box, to start thinking and coming back to nationhood again, to sovereignty and jurisdiction and self-determination again. And that's why we're here for the next 2 days. That Indian Act. And then things started happening after that Indian Act. These little governments started forming. We say how these little governments, the provinces, the territories. Back home, Saskatchewan, 1905 became. Same thing with Alberta, Manitoba. But these little governments started forming. And then they started forgetting. And they started talking to people as if there was no other orders of government in Canada, and there's only 2 orders of government, the federal government, provincial governments. And we're saying, what? The recognition as a 3rd order of government are Indigenous peoples. but it started offloading, provinces becoming formed. And so people started to forget First Nations law, First Nations jurisdiction, First Nations governments. And everybody started acting like there's only two orders of government: federal government, provincial governments. And then municipal governments, who are creatures of the provinces, and we're all seeing what's happening in Toronto, what's going on over there. But they're creatures. Municipal governments are creatures of the provinces. Well, our governments aren't like that. So a third order of government, recognition as a third order of government. So these provinces started happening. And then for us back home in 1930, it applies to three prairie provinces, this piece called the 1930 Natural Resources Transfer Agreement. But applied in different territories and provinces of BC and Ontario, there's something else, but it's all about land and resources. But the federal crown transferred to these little crowns with no consultation nor consent, but they just did it, the NRTA. And there's still, we say there was no right for that to happen, but it did. So back home we say depth of a plow wasn't respected. So there's legal challenges, constitutional challenges. 1930. 1961, offloading. Federal government to provincial governments, three main areas. Billions of dollars for education, billions of dollars for health care, billions of dollars for social. 1960, 61, 62 started offloading, transferring government, transferring federal fiduciary trust treaty obligations from the big government to the little governments. We weren't involved, but that happened. So even when anyone here gets sick or goes to a hospital, you go to a hospital under provincial jurisdiction, but the provinces get a big bunch of money for that. That's offloading. Happened in the 60s. I can remember back home, at one time there was Indian hospitals just for Indians. Some of you might remember that. And we always viewed that as an example of that treaty right to health care being respected when we had a system for First Nations health care. We viewed that as that federal government, federal fiduciary trust obligation. Then they started offloading to provinces. They started offloading. And there's only a couple left now. But how do you maintain that jurisdiction over those hospitals? First Nations health care. But that started happening. So I'm talking about offloading in the 60s. And then, 1982, Canada patriated the Constitution and cut the umbilical cord to Britain. That very important day on April 1982. And that important section in there, Section 35. Existing Aboriginal treaty rights are recognized and affirmed. Existing Aboriginal and treaty rights are recognized and affirmed. And we have always said it's a full box of rights, including the right to self-government, the right to self-determination. And if it is indeed a full box of rights, then we have to exert that right. And we can't wait and rely on other governments to say, oh, you're going to have these rights, but only if there's a legislation process in place and only if you agree. They're not contingent rights. They're Aboriginal rights, they're inherent rights, they're treaty rights. They're not contingent on anything. So to exert and assert and implement and enforce those rights in Section 35 is going to be the challenge now going forward. So that's Section 35, full box of rights. And then, 10, 11 years ago, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Very important document that speaks to not only to Indigenous people's rights in Canada, but Indigenous people's rights throughout the world. And yes, self-determination is in there. And yes, free, prior, and informed consent is in there. And how do we use that now, in 2018 and beyond? And there's another important piece. Not just the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's also another declaration. The Organization of American States, the OAS Declaration. And both have been passed and endorsed. And we want to make sure that Canada says strong statements about the OAS one too. Because whichever declaration has a stronger clause is the one that should be used. I'm saying it's simple, reserved. Paul's going to explain it better. But that's how I understand it. And so that's an important piece, a very important piece. The last point on this timeline, these two declarations, Bill C-262 is something else that's percolating. And how do we use that private member's bill? Because that was a bill from NDP Romeo Saganash to implement the UN Declaration. And so that's supported. We encourage people to keep supporting it, get it passed through Senate, get it done, because that is something moving ahead. And there was always this push factor because there's this October of 2019 deadline date coming, and people think, oh wow, we got to get stuff done. October 2019 is coming, there's a federal government election. So it's pushing people to react and respond. But in terms of this piece of legislation, we always say clearly, we got to do things and do things right. We all want to move beyond the Indian Act. We all want to exert jurisdiction and have self-government, self-determination respected and honored and our rights implemented and enforced. But take the time to do it right. Because if any legislation is introduced within the next two months, people are going to say, whoa. And we have our AFN resolution that says that, to halt the process and have a more honorable process with the Crown, something that's First Nations led, First Nations driven. And we want those words, those good words that were said by the Crown at the United Nations, those good words that were said by the Prime Minister and different ministers of the Crown, to really have effect within the bureaucracy. Because we've always said the legislative and the judicial branches of government are saying good things about inherent rights, Aboriginal rights and treaty rights, but the executive branch doesn't always keep up. And I'm talking about Privy Council and all the deputy ministers and all the bureaucracies. They don't always keep up with the vision that's being expounded. And so we have to change to keep up with that vision. So that's the historical context, chiefs and relatives and delegates here. I want to make sure that people don't forget 3 orders of government, not just 2. I want to make sure as well that these policies, there's 4 policies that are outdated, very important policies. They may not have to be part of any legislative framework. That work needs to be done to fix and update policies that are currently based on termination of rights and title, not recognition of rights and title. I'm talking about the comprehensive claims policy, the specific claims policy, the additions to reserve policy, and the big one, the inherent right to self-government policy. They've all got to be fixed and updated based on the Chilcotin case, Supreme Court decision, all these Supreme Court decisions that we've won. The judicial branch is recognizing our rights. So everything has to be caught up. Those policies have to be changed and updated. We're also going to be learning from our relatives that have had their space in this work now for a year or so, our relatives in leadership in British Columbia, because they've had some meetings over there, and they've contracted a very smart lady to help draft something for them. So Louise Mandel we wanted here because she's been given a task to draft something. Drafting instructions, but based on what the leadership want in their territory, and according to their terms, according to their rights and title. And so we have asked her to come to share that, because there was some direction from that territory to move, because we don't agree with this one over here from the Crown. But we've got something over here that we want to share and move on. And so we want to listen to that. We want to learn from that and want to see what's in there. Maybe we can use that too. And then we also, so that's from that territory. But then we also want to show that respect as well to hear from Grand Chief Peters, Gord Peters. And when we're talking about how do we set this up, we got to have dialogue, we got to have discussion, we got to learn. What are the concerns and issues? What are some of the solutions you see? And how can we move this forward? And if those concerns can be addressed, what are they and how can we learn from that? So we want to hear. So we have that on the agenda. To hear from Louise, we'll hear from Grand Chief Gord Peters, to share that, to listen, to learn, to dialogue. And how can we make this better? Because it's all about moving beyond the Indian Act. And it's all about exerting ourselves again as nations. But you have to drive that, not AFN. All we're doing here is facilitating. We're facilitating, creating that space for dialogue, to educate each other. Education and awareness leads to understanding, should lead to action. And that's the forum of this, the goal of this forum here. So chiefs and relatives and friends, we also wanted to hear, when you look at the agenda, the way it's set up, we have different speakers, and they'll be talking from their experience and their perspectives, from a national perspective, from an international perspective. How does this all fit? But it's all meant to move beyond the Indian Act. But to be clear, as AFN, as National Chief, as an Escopius, a servant or helper, we're just trying to bring that dialogue here. It's up to the leadership and the rights and title holders to decide. We want to make sure you have as much up-to-date information. And yes, we're going to hear from Minister Bennett and what they're doing. And yes, we've also done that analysis, and that's in your kits. So I was telling the organizers, what's going in the kits? What's the information presented? So if I'm coming in, and I always role play it, if I'm Chief of Little Black Bear, why am I coming to this forum? Why am I spending $200 of my money to come over here? That kit's better be worth $200. But you also get 2 meals out of it. So we're trying to make it value added, chiefs and delegates, that registration fee, you're going to get something out of it. There's something, information there that's worthwhile that you can take home and learn from this. But to be clear is when we need the Crown to present. So when we're setting the agenda up, we need to hear from the Crown. And then we need as well the chiefs to have that back and forth. And so you'll see that back and forth here, but you also have time for your regional forums, dialogue, discussions this afternoon. And then come back with thoughts and ideas for recommendations. So chiefs, that's the historical overview and the delegates here at this policy forum. I know as well there are some regional chiefs on our AFN executive. We do have an executive meeting coming up in a few weeks, and this will be one of the agenda items, no question, amongst other things. So I want to ask you all to put your heads and minds and hearts together, and how we can listen and learn in a respectful way, and take something back home in a good way, and to know that we're slowing things down and trying to do things in a good way. Because to get things done in 2 months is too quick, too fast. And so at Cree we use that word, peetak, be careful. We want to make sure people understand this. So to the Crown, to Mr. Bennett, we're not saying no, we're saying it's got to be First Nations driven. And people have to understand. And utilizing those words of free, prior, and informed consent to make sure everybody understands what's involved here. And then we'll feel good about it. Because right now, there's not a good feeling right now. You know, and people have to feel good that things are going to go in a good way, so that there is a light for our children and grandchildren, that we do move beyond that Indian Act. But it's a process. And it's a process that takes time. And I always use those words, education, awareness, understanding, and action. So, chiefs, relatives, and friends, let's have a good 2 days. I'm trying to set that historical context. We said we'd get together as soon as we can after July, and here we are. Let's put our heads and minds and have a really good constructive dialogue next 2 days. With that, Egose, Naskum Tinual. Hi, hi.